express to you all my stress.
There's a shot. Yeah, the impact of the bed. Oh,
Oh, look at that. All right. All right.
My neighbors don't pose like that.
No. Pretty spectacular photo. I did not take it. I won't take credit for it.
Next to those.
So I don't know if we want to, I mean, we're about 5 past. Do you guys want to get started?
Sure.
Everyone feel good? Do we mind if we turn the lights off? I feel like I've got a lot of good images, so I want to make sure they're as popular as possible. All right. All right, so my name's Jacqueline Camo, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I've been invited here tonight to talk with you about the Deerfield Wind Black Bear Study, which is a project the Fish and Wildlife Department is doing to better understand the impacts of the Deerfield Wind Energy Project on black bear habitat use. So before I go into the specifics of the study, I just want to provide a little bit of context about what the Fish and Wildlife Department does and why we would be engaged in this kind of study to begin with. So our mission is the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all the people of Vermont. And we kind of address this mission in a variety of ways. We look at conservation issues at the entire state level, all the way down to individual woodlots. We're working with entire ecosystems and natural communities, and then we're also trying to address the conservation needs of individual species here in Vermont. So, when we're thinking about black bears here in Vermont, we have a 4-pronged management and conservation approach. We work with Vermont hunters. I guess first I should say that we are responsible for overseeing the state's bear hunting season. And so that we work with those bear hunters to collect age and sex data from all of the bears that are harvested in the state. And that information helps us generate an estimate of how many bears we have in Vermont. And we can track that number over time to kind of get a feel for the health of Vermont's bear population. We also work with Vermonters to try to resolve and prevent conflicts between bears and people. And we do that by providing information about black bears to the public, and we also work with individual people who are having issues with bears to try to help them understand why the bear is coming into their yard and what they can do to prevent it from coming back. We also do a lot of management effort on habitat needs for bears. So we are actively involved in land conservation here in the state. We also help design management projects on state lands to improve habitat conditions for bears. We work with private landowners to provide guidance on what they can do to create good bear habitat on their lands. And then we also try to help minimize negative impacts of development towards black bear habitat needs through the state's regulatory review process. And then finally, we occasionally engage in research to try to better understand our bears here in Vermont. And most of our research projects tend to be focused on understanding the habitat needs of bears and how development might impact those habitat needs. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources to put this level of detail into a conservation plan for every species here in Vermont. So we have to kind of prioritize which species we're going to put this level of detail towards. And we feel like bears are justified in that because they serve as an umbrella species for other species here in Vermont. And how that works is because bears need access to wetlands to meet a lot of their food needs. they need access to young forests, to have access for berries and apples and things like that that they need to eat. They also need access to mature forests for all the nuts and insects that you usually find in those types of habitats. And
What
so-
foods do they get from the wetlands?
Oh, good question. Mainly vegetation, but there's also a lot of fruit-producing shrubs that grow in wetlands too.
Okay,
But lots of grasses and sedges also.
all right.
So if we are providing these habitat types along with the connectivity between them, so bears can move across the landscape and they can easily find wetlands and find young forests and find mature forests, then we're gonna have a healthy bear population. But we're also gonna be providing the needs for all those other wildlife species that also need those habitat types. And so that's what I mean when I say we use black bears as an umbrella species here in Vermont. So one specific habitat type though that we really focus on are what we call bear-scarred beach concentrations. And we actually consider these critical habitat for bears. And so I mentioned earlier that we consider bear habitat when we go through the state's regulatory review process. And this is specifically what we're looking for. So if a major development project is proposed here in Vermont, biologists with our department will review the project and they'll specifically look for if that project is going to potentially damage concentrations of bear-scarred beach. Why bear-scarred beach is so important is because beech nuts produced by beech trees are a really important food source for bears. The nuts are high in calories, they have a high protein content, and it's a really important food for bears to put on the weight that they need to successfully enter their den for the winter. Beech trees produce nuts not every year, but actually typically every other year. And in those years that they do produce good nuts, all the beech trees in a certain area will produce nuts that same year. So even though these nuts are really tiny, if a bear can go into an area with a lot of beech trees in those good years, they have access to thousands upon thousands and thousands of these nuts. And so they can put on a lot of weight during those falls. And research in Maine actually showed that black bears were synchronizing their reproduction with beech nut production. What I mean by that is that female black bears only give birth to cubs every other year because the cubs will stay with their mother for 18 months. So they only have the ability to produce cubs every other year. And in Maine, females were producing cubs in those years following good beech nut production. So it kind of indicated that they needed those nuts to really put on enough weight to successfully produce cubs and nurse and lactate for them. So that brings us to the Deerfield Wind Energy Project. So I'm sure most of you in this room have seen the new turbines associated with this project. It consists of 15 300-foot turbines. It's been built across two kind of parallel ridge lines, across about 4 miles of remote ridge lines in Searsburg and Reedsboro. It's entirely on the Green Mountain National Forest, and it's actually the first wind project built on national forest in the country. And so when this project was first proposed, the proposal came to our department for review for potential impacts on wildlife. And what threw up a big red flag for us were the large amounts of bear-scarred beach concentrations on these ridges, which is represented by these black outlined polygons. And these are actually the largest bear-scarred beach concentrations that we know of left in the state. So we requested that the energy company find an alternative site for the project. However, folks advocating for the energy project pointed out that because there are so many beech in this area, that yes, they would have to remove a number of trees on what we call this west ridge, and a little bit here on the east ridge, but overall there would still be so many beech trees left that there'd still be plenty of food for bears. We were still concerned though about not knowing what relationship bears have with these wind turbines. Would they still feel comfortable coming into these areas and feeding on nuts in the shadow of these turbines, especially considering that these are such remote beach stands, and bears weren't used to having to interact with people much in these areas. But no one really knew the answer to that question. So ultimately, the Vermont Public Service Board granted the permit for the project, but they made two requirements of the energy company. One, they required that they conserve lake habitat as mitigation, which means that they find bear-scarred beach concentrations in other parts of southern Vermont to conserve. And two, that they fund a study to evaluate what, if any, impacts this energy project has on black bear use of those areas. And so that brings us to the focal objective of our study, which is evaluating bear habitat use and movement before and after the operation of the Deerfield Wind project. And that breaks down into a few specific questions that we're looking at. So basically, do bears use those bear-scarred beach concentrations less after the wind project goes into operation? Does their pattern of how they use those beach concentrations change? So for example, do they maybe still go into those stands to feed on beech nuts, but now maybe they only go at night? And if we do see some sort of displacement or change in how and when they're using those concentrations, where do they go to find an alternative food to replace that lost food source? And one fear we had was that it may shift bears into backyards more often. So this is a little cut off, but we began to address those objectives. We felt that the best way to get the information we needed was to fit a sample of bears with GPS satellite collars. So we began that effort in the fall of 2011 and really ramped up that effort during the summer of 2012. In the fall of 2016, the Deerfield Wind Energy Project began construction, and it officially went into operation just last spring in 2018. And we anticipate the study to end probably during the winter or early spring of 2021. And why the end is kind of determined on beech nut production. And so here, during this timeline, you can see these are all the years or all the falls when the beech trees in this area produced a lot of nuts. So the fall of 2013 and the fall of 2015 both occurred before construction began. So those years serve as like our baseline data or our understanding of how bears were using that area before the Deerfield project existed. The fall of 2017 represents information about how these bears interacted with this site during that construction period. And then based on this kind of cycle, we expect this fall in 2019 to be another good beech nut production year. And so that will probably serve as our year of trying to understand how they're now interacting with that area now that the project's in operation. So, like I said, we started collaring bears in 2011, and up until this past summer, we've had 41 bears collared, but we only tend to have 8 to 14 bears collared at any one given time. You can kind of see this red polygon here, and this represents what we call a virtual fence. And so that virtual fence is programmed into these collars. And so the collars can recognize when they're inside this polygon versus outside. So when they're inside this polygon, they're collecting one location every 20 minutes. So we're getting really detailed information of how bears are moving in that area. And then when they're outside of that area, they're collecting a location every 3 hours. So we are collecting a lot of information about how these bears are moving around. And we've been focusing on catching bears in this area, mainly in Searsburg and Reedsboro, because we want to understand how bears who really live here full time are interacting with the turbines. However, we have learned very quickly that our study area is much larger than that. Bears that have been captured in that area tend to use this entire area. So we have found that Route 9 serves roughly as a northern boundary for these animals. So we do see bears who will cross Route 9, but the majority of bears who are captured south of Route 9 spend the majority of their life south of Route 9. So we feel like it's probably a big enough and busy enough road that it really prevents them from wanting to just flow across it routinely. We see the same thing happening down in Massachusetts along Route 2. So we see most of these bears that we're catching here in Vermont, they spend most of their time in Vermont, but they certainly will use habitat in Massachusetts pretty regularly. But for the most part, we don't see them wanting to cross Route 2 a lot. And then to the east and west, on the east edge, we see Harriman Reservoir makes a pretty hard boundary for them. And then when they get south of the reservoir, they'll go a little farther east of the Deerfield River Valley, but not that far east of it. And then to the west, kind of the Bennington-Pownell Valley down here in Route 7 is kind of a soft boundary. But they'll definitely kind of take advantage of the Hoosics over here in New York as well. All right, so now I'm going to go through a handful of specific animals and what we've seen them do.
How many miles distance is that from, say, the right-hand corner to the far left?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think. Does anyone know off the top of their head from Wilmington to Bennington roughly how many miles that is? 20-ish?
20.
Okay.
So it's probably 25 on the diagonal there.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
And you'll see pretty quickly with some of these maps that I'm going to show how that different bears have used different areas for sure. So this is a little messy. I'm going to go into some specifics that are a little cleaner and easier to read, but just to give you an overview. This is a female. The location's from a female that we had collared from July 2014. We actually had her collared until the fall of 2017, but these points will only go until the fall of 2016. This blue square here kind of highlights what we considered her core home range area. So like 90% of the time, she was going to be in this area. However, you can see these orange and green points, which are the fall and early spring. You can see these kind of movements to the south and to the north. And that's what I want to show you guys, are these kind of movements away from her core home range. So first, we'll look at her movements to the north. These occurred in the fall of 2015, which was a good beech nut production year. And again, this was before the Deerfield Wind Energy Project began construction. So we saw in, I think it was probably like early October, she made this kind of 7 to 8 kilometer movement to the northwest, right up into those bear-scarred beech concentrations that we were concerned about. She spent almost 2 months up there, presumably foraging on beech nuts. Then she returned back to her core home range to den for the winter. And then that following spring, she came out of her den. And I think she came out of her den probably the first week in April, which is pretty typical for females in this area. She went right back up into those beech stands, fed for another 3-ish weeks, and then returned back down to her home range. And we never saw her go back up there. And we had never seen her go up there before this time either. So this was pretty exciting for us because it kind of highlighted what we thought was going on already. We felt like these large bear-scarred beech concentrations are such a big, important food source for bears that they're not only feeding the bears who live right there, but they're actually kind of sucking bears out of their normal home ranges. Bears are willing to travel to get to this important food source.
So I have a question. Was she using the area around the existing Searsburg Wind Project?
Not much. So it's hard to see on this map. The Searsburg project is right here. And I think there'll be some other maps kind of showing how the beech stands relate to Searsburg. But Searsburg, the beach stands for the most part kind of circle below the ridge along that section, so they're actually up above the beach. And again, that's kind of the case with this area too. This part of Deerfield is only barely coming into this beach stand, but what we've actually seen is that this whole ridge, along with providing beach nuts, there's also a lot of mountain ash up there, which is another important food for bears. It's a soft berry, so it doesn't have the calorie punch that nuts do, but we're also seeing, so you can see how she's got all these points here that are outside of the beach. There's a lot of mountain ash there, so I think she was kind of switching between mountain ash and beech nuts while she was up there. All right, now we look at her movement to the south. So these occurred during the fall of 2014. Poor beech nut crop that year, and again, it was before Deerfield Wind existed. And so she moved, and again, this was more like mid-August. She made this movement down into Massachusetts, spent a couple months down there, and again, eventually come November, she returned back to her home range to Den. And what was going on this year is that acorn production was really good. And I don't know if any of you spend much time down in Massachusetts, but it is a stark difference between up on the plateau and then just dropping a few miles into Massachusetts. There's very few acorns or oak trees up on the plateau, but you go down to Massachusetts and it immediately transitions into oak forests. And so that's what we're learning from this study, is that those oak forests down in Massachusetts are key to the health of the bear population that lives right here in southern Vermont.
When
Yeah.
there's a good when there's a good beech crop, is that region-wide or is it stand-specific? So may there be a really good beech crop in Sunderland when there's a really bad one down in Deerfield?
Exactly. It's definitely more stand specific, but quasi-regional too. So we go out and we do beech nut counts basically every fall throughout the entire state of Vermont. And we're not going out and counting nuts in every beech stand, but we're trying to get like a representation in each region in Vermont. So we might see like a really great bumper crop of beech nuts here in southern Vermont one year, but the Northeast Kingdom might be a complete failure. But usually if they're good right here, you know, most of southern Vermont is probably going to be good. But we have seen years, I think, you know, there's so much beech right in this area. We have seen some years where this study area tends to be a little bit better than maybe other parts of southern Vermont. Yeah.
Is there a problem with the beech trees around here?
Yeah, gosh, we could talk an hour about beech bark disease, which is what's going on with all of our beech trees across the Northeast. Yeah, so that began, I think it was the 60s or 70s when the beech wave began. And it's a complicating factor in all of this. So it's a disease that is killing our beech trees. There seems to be some natural resistances to it, but generally the majority of our trees are susceptible. It seems to shorten their lives. However, they still seem to produce a lot of nuts even with this disease. And they're still able to regenerate new trees. The issue with beech is that they kind of exist in almost like these clone forests where a lot of the trees, they're like root sprouting off of each other. So like you might be looking at 30 trees that all are originating from just one tree. So if that one tree is sick, all of the root sprouts or clones are also going to be susceptible to the disease. So that was, not to go too deep into that rabbit hole, but that you know, that was another argument that's been made against us trying to, you know, ask for this site to be built in an alternative site, is that, hey, these beech trees are dying anyways, but we tend to feel like they're here providing food right now for our bears, and so there's a lot of value in that. We don't know what it's going to be like in 100 years, so it's better to kind of leave them on the landscape and let nature sort it out instead of us going out and just removing all of the trees. But yeah, it's complicated. This is kind of washed out. I wanted to show one more example of how these bears are using Massachusetts. I know you can't really see what's going on here, so I'll point it out. This is a different female that we had collared for at least 3 years. And again, in that same time period that other female moved south into Massachusetts, this female, whose typical home range was up along the northwest edge of Harriman Reservoir, she also traveled down into Massachusetts. Here's the state line. And she went into a big state forest down here in Massachusetts, spent about a month feeding on acorns. Then she moved a little farther east into another state forest in Massachusetts, fed on oaks. And then you can see there in late October, she traveled right back up into her home range. And in less than a week of returning back to her home range, she entered her den. The cool thing about this is that we know she had cubs with her that year. So she and her cubs made this long distance trip, which, in total is roughly 65 kilometers. And so this is kind of a cool thing to think about with bears as well, is those cubs are spending, the first 18 months of their life with their mother. And basically she's keeping them alive, which is an important responsibility, but she's also teaching them what is food, where to find food, how to get food. And so it's kind of cool to see, how they're showing these other bears how to move across the landscape. Other cool thing is just, too, that these bears are focusing a lot on public or state lands down in Massachusetts when they do go down there. So again, it reinforces, the benefits of conserving habitat for wildlife. They are actually using it. All right. So now we're going to zoom out and start looking at the points from a few different males. And so again, you can kind of see when I was showing you those core home range areas for those females, pretty compact areas compared to when you look at a male. I mean, this male's points basically cover the entire study area that I showed you in that earlier map. But we'll look at some kind of specific movements within all of this chaos. All right. So, this male, this was during the fall of 2017, which was a good beech nut production year. And it was also during the construction phase of the Deerfield Wind project. That year, this was, I guess, the second year we had him collared, but we had learned that he liked to spend a lot of time on Mount Anthony over in Bennington. And so these points kind of start on the west side of Mount Anthony. On September 23rd, all of a sudden, he started making this eastern movement, and he did a big loop through kind of all of the beach stands associated with the Deerfield Wind project, but then immediately headed back west down into kind of the Bennington-Pownell Valley there along Route 7. And it's kind of cool if you look at kind of the point when he first entered the Deerfield Wind project area, and then the last point when he exited and started heading back. I mean, those are within less than 24 hours of each other. So we kind of scratched our heads, like, all right, why did he just do this really fast walkabout through what we consider prime bear habitat, but decided not to stay? It could be because of the disturbance of the construction that was going on there.
They were blasting up there.
I think they were
that
done
year.
blasting at that point, but they may have still been. And yeah, that's something we need to
2017,
look at.
right.
We need, we're going to have access to those records, and so that's something we'll specifically look at, like what were they doing still. But I know at that point, at least some of the turbines were up. But either way, it was a busy, loud time. The other thing that could be going on is that it's also, late September is still a little early for the beech nuts to really be ripe. So maybe he was just doing like a walkabout and just kind of checking things out, like, yeah, I see a lot of nuts, but they're not quite ready for me, so I'm gonna go back to where I have some other foods. And sadly, if you can't probably tell from there, but these points here are in cornfields. And so that was the other food he was looking for. But let's jump ahead now to mid-October. Same bear, totally different scale of a map here. But again, here's Mount Anthony. again, which was his starting point earlier, and that's actually his starting point again. He's still over kind of in the foothill, western part of Mount Anthony here. Again, he makes this direct movement to those beach stands, but again, just kind of blazes right through the area. Now, we don't have the excuse that the beech nuts weren't ready yet. We know by October 19th, that's like prime beech nut feeding time. So he cruises through that area, and then he just keeps going. He went up by like Mount Snow, then he skirted around Somerset Reservoir, kind of meandered along the Kelly Stand Road up there for a little bit, then dropped in onto the valley between Arlington and Sunderland, then back up to the mountains, over into New York, down into the valley, skirted around these mountains here, dropped back into the valley, and then eventually kind of hit the mountains here, dropped south, crossed Route 9 close to Bennington, and then ended up back in those cornfields again.
So just one question.
Yeah,
How large is this snail?
that's a great question, and
Does he have the ability to climb the trees, or is he something that obviously has to?
he has the ability to climb, and that's a good point. So we're talking about these bear-scarred beach stands, and so the scarring is what we're looking for because it shows the bears have been climbing. But we know that they're climbing to feed on nuts out of the trees, but they're also foraging for the nuts on the ground too. And yes, younger, smaller bears tend to climb trees more easily than a really big, like 200, 300, 400 pound male bear. This male was 4 years old this year. So that's still, from a male perspective, we kind of consider that a subadult still. Like, from what we see with the males in this area, they don't tend to seem to have access to breeding until around like 5 or 6 years of age. But I will say he was probably over 200 pounds at that point. He was a pretty big male. But that's another feature that could be going on. We know there's good beech nuts up there, so why didn't he stay? Could have been the disturbance of the construction, and it could also be that he's still kind of a subadult male, and he might have gotten up there and had a nasty run-in with another male and just said, oh, not worth it. But I tend to think that's a little less likely because there's so much space up there, and we've seen through some cameras, which I'm going to talk about later, how these animals seem to kind of share the food, take turns. It's hard to know when you look at just one individual, but it certainly makes you wonder. Here's another male, and this is a mature male. So we've had him collared since June of 2013, and he's still collared today. This winter he just turned 11 years old, so he's getting up there in age. And honestly, this map is just from his points through last fall, or 2017 fall. We've actually learned that he's actually used a lot more over here in New York this past year. So this isn't even a perfect representation of his home range anymore. But for our purposes, it will do. So if we look at the fall of 2017, again, good beech nut production, and it was during the construction phase of the energy project. Again, on October 11th, prime beech nut feeding time, we see him head up through those beech stands, but same deal as that last male, he didn't stick around. So again, like I said, he was a mature male at that point, so he shouldn't be getting pushed around by other bears. He should be able to do what he wants from bears' perspective. But he chose to just cruise right through. He hit Harriman Reservoir and followed it down to the south end and then continued east. And then he headed a little bit north and then headed east again until he hit the edge of Brattleboro and said, no thank you, I'm going to turn around, and he started coming back. And you can see these little clusters, so he wasn't just like racing back, he was stopping and feeding. probably finding other beach stands, maybe some oak stands along the way. He hit the reservoir again, and it shows these 2 points line up like he would have gone across the reservoir, and he might have. We have seen bears swimming the reservoir, or it could be that he looped around it. Just within 3 hours, he was able to make it around. So anyways, he hit Route 8, well, not quite. He first started to drop down here, which this is kind of interesting. Down here is where the Florida Wind Project is. So he hit the edge of the Florida Wind Project, turned around, followed Route 8 back up, and then eventually was able to cross to get back into his normal home range where he denned for the winter. So this one really had us scratching our heads because we'd known this bear for years. We barely would see him go east of 8-100, let alone over towards Harriman Reservoir and all the way to Brattleboro. Yeah.
What is the breeding season for
June.
when males would be traveling greater distances?
It's actually June and sometimes into July. So bears have a cool setup where they breed during the summer, early summer. Then females have what's called delayed implantation. So the fertilized egg doesn't implant until, I think it's around November. So they're technically not pregnant until the fall, and then they give birth usually in January in their winter den. So yeah, it's, you know, we often see these big movements during the summer when they're breeding, or during a fall when there's bad food production in their normal home range. But this guy, this was a great natural food year for him. So they also just, we don't understand all of the things that they do and what motivates them. But again, it does make you wonder, like, we know there were some of the best beech nut production we've seen since we've been doing this study was in the fall of 2017. And so why didn't he stick around in any of those beach stands?
Did you observe a lot of uneaten beech nuts up there that year because the bears were just going through?
That would be a hard thing to say because we go up there and we just basically like, you know, we sit under, you know, about 20-ish trees with like a meter stick and we count every nut in that little meter, but we don't go back to see like, are they cleaning up all of those nuts? But usually when we're in those, they're doing those surveys, we can tell lots of wildlife have been in there. We do, which I'm gonna get to once we're done looking at the bear locations, we do have some cameras set up in there also to try to get a better sense of like, what are the animals doing when they're in these areas? And we haven't started analyzing those numbers yet, but that might help tie into some of that. Like, are we seeing bears spending as much time or actually foraging when they're in these areas during that year? But I do suspect, looking at some of these locations, that the disturbance of the construction phase probably was a real thing for these animals.
You said that particular male went down to the Massachusetts Wind Project that was operational. I mean, that
Yeah.
produces noise and vibration.
Yeah.
Have you seen any behaviors that would indicate that they're sensitive to that low frequency noise and vibration?
Not really, and the next slides I'm going to show will kind of talk to that. But I will say, because I'm not going to talk about the Florida project at all again, so I'll just say we have had other bears that have been collared whose home ranges may be tied in more closely with that area. And so we have seen bears kind of feeding on, there are some beach stands down there too, feeding in those areas. I almost wonder if here's a bear, he's never really been anywhere near a wind turbine before. So if he is disturbed by the actual turbines, it's probably because he has no experience with it, would be my guess.
Question about,
Yeah.
what's the time frame between these different yellow dots?
Yeah, so I was saying before, when they're in this area, it's every 20 minutes, and when it's outside of this red polygon, it's about every 3 hours. But when these bears are moving quickly, and if there's a large distance between, you know, if they went a really long distance in those 3 hours between points, the satellites can sometimes struggle to pinpoint where they are. So they aren't always collecting a location every 3 hours. Sometimes it might only be once or twice a day if they're in like really heavy cover or moving quickly through an area. So, yeah.
And just one final question.
Yeah.
I see from October to November, obviously, the hunting season is heavy.
Yep.
Was there a great deal of interactions with those hunters that utilize dogs and actually push these bears?
Yeah, that's another thing we've wondered when we look at these. I will say though, so in Vermont, our hound hunters have a training season that actually starts June 1st. So even though the hunting season starts September 1st, there's the potential that these bears could be interacting with dogs basically all summer and fall. So we have, you know, that's another thing we've wondered sometimes when we see like all of a sudden a weird long distance movement, like, did that bear just get run by dogs? But we've had other collared bears where there's some houndsmen that live locally here that we've actually worked with to try to capture.
That's my question.
Yeah.
Did you have interactions with the houndsmen?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, most houndsmen that I'm familiar with would prefer not to shoot the bear. They enjoy actually doing what they
Exactly.
consider the hunt.
Yep.
So there was good interactions with the houndsmen.
We've had good interactions with most of the houndsmen.
Good.
And so they'll sometimes let us know, like, hey, you know, we'll get a text or an email, like, hey, by the way, on this date, I ran one of your collared bears. And most of the time, we can't even tell that it happened when we go back and look at the points for that time period. And then other times we do see, like, they'll make a bit of a movement. We've never seen anything like this as a result that we know of the hound hunting. They usually might just, like, move over to the other edge of their home range for a couple days or something like that. But yeah, I mean, that is another factor that's going on the landscape for sure. So I don't want to give the impression that all the bears, it's been a mass exodus and they've all left those ridge lines, because that's not the case. So we were just looking at some examples of males who, as you've seen, have the ability to move really long distances, and they have really big home ranges. Our females, much tighter home ranges. Because of the burden of raising young, they tend to not have the flexibility to just take off on these extravagant walkabouts like the males do. So this is a female who we've had collared since the summer of 2014, and she's still collared today. This is a kind of example of her points from June 2014 through December 2017. And so you can see her home range is right within the Deerfield Wind project area. So if we look at her points from the fall of 2015, when there was good beech nut production, and it was before the Deerfield Wind project began construction, you can see that fall, her points almost perfectly mirrored that beech stand. It was pretty cool when we saw this from this bear. Like, we need to keep this bear alive and collared because she is going to really show us a lot once the energy project goes into operation. Then, if you look at her points, same exact time period, fall 2017, another great beech nut production year. There's a dramatic shift, I think. You can see this area. In this area, she's still using relatively the same, at least just, you know, looking at it from our eyes view. We haven't run any of this through any like statistical analysis yet. But now she's barely using the stand, if at all. You know, those points, you know, there's a little bit of clustering, so she may have fed in here a bit. But when I see points like this, it's probably her just traveling through. And now she's shifted her movement into this beech stand over there. Again, there's a lot of factors that could be influencing this, particularly social dynamics that could be going on. So let's see, she was probably 4 or 5 years old during this fall. You know, and so, but from a female's perspective, you know, they kind of reach maturity younger than the males do. But you know, maybe over time something has changed where she now has access to different areas that she didn't before. I don't know. And that's where what we're gonna have to do is take all of these case studies of these individuals where it kind of makes you scratch your head, you can start hypothesizing all these different factors that might be contributing to how they're moving. And we need to start pulling them as a whole and seeing what we're seeing. And if we can start teasing out patterns that are not true for just the individual, but are true for the whole population of our bears here.
So in October, November 2017, was the
Yeah.
construction completed and were the turbines all operating, or were they still constructing?
It was a mix of construction, but if I remember correctly, at that point, it was kind of like the detailed construction. But there was still like heavy equipment up there working on the roads.
People.
Yeah, there were still people around. I think most of the turbines were up, but I think they were still kind of getting up the last one or two. So yeah, it was different.
I'm sure
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The rest of your studies probably tended to look at stuff like this, but what in the area of that beach stand that she's abandoned, at least temporarily,
Yeah.
like what percentage of the beech trees have actually been removed as part of the project construction?
Yeah, I don't know that exact number. But it's a significant amount. I mean, I'm sure it's like, we're talking like hundreds of acres have been removed. However, you look at this map, so basically what happened is, each of these has a big like landing pad that it's built on top of. There's a really large road up there now, larger than you would think is necessary for just the general maintenance, but they had to put in a big road just to get all the equipment up there to put up these turbines. So there was a loss of a lot of trees. However, I will say, like, along the edges, and these polygons aren't perfect. In general, the beach stands are actually probably a little bit larger than what these polygons show. So there still are a lot of beech trees up there. And the other thing that I was about to say, and I feel like ties in with what you're asking also, is that what I'm showing you is during the construction phase. So we could potentially argue that the construction phase is going to be the most disruptive stage of this project. Maybe after a couple of years, once all the equipment's out of there, all the blasting is done, and the tree cutting and the dirt work is quieted down, that's going to be the real question. Do these turbines just spinning, is that still a disturbance to them? Do we still see this shifting happening 2 years out after the wind project is in
So I was
operation?
wondering if there's enough of the resource left, if the turbines aren't having a major effect themselves, for
Exactly.
the bears to come back post-construction.
Yeah, and that's really, this is interesting, but I don't think anyone would have thought this wouldn't be disruptive, the construction phase. That's the real key. Is it that going to actually disturb them?
Follow up on your comment about the size of the polygons.
Yeah.
How big of a difference is there in nut production within these polygons and say where she is in,
Yeah.
right next to Route 8 there? Are there still big beech trees and maybe it's 60% as much nuts, but it's quiet?
Yeah, and that's something that's going to be hard for us to tease out specifically because, so when we do our surveys, like I said, we're just doing like a sample. So we'll usually do a beech nut survey at this end of the stand. We do one over here and usually over there. So if there's like micro differences happening within the stand, we may not be able to detect that from our surveys. But, we may be able to, with enough fancy statistics, looking at all these locations, start to kind of tease some of that out. Yeah, and that it could just be, there's enough natural variation going on that maybe some of these choices she's making are for those reasons and not because of the Deerfield project. But the hope is we've got enough animals collared with enough baseline data that we're going to be able to pick up some sort of relationship between the energy project, if it exists, if it actually is influencing them. And then one last kind of interesting movement I wanted to show that is a little bit independent of the Deerfield project, but I think has some potential for a loose connection, is this use of these cornfields that I've mentioned in the Bennington-Pownell Valley. So here's another male that we had collared from June 2013 through the fall of 2015. And you can see his home range was kind of this whole area around Reedsboro and up to Route 9 and then down into Massachusetts. And he would occasionally cross Route 8 and kind of utilize stuff over here, but for the most part, he didn't head that way all that often. But during those late summers and early falls, we would see him drop into the cornfields. And in the fall of 2015, he ended up getting harvested out of one of those cornfields by a hunter. And this we've seen as a common issue, especially with the male bears. Corn seems to really be a draw for them, and it's a major risk. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but we've lost, oh gosh, I want to say at least a half a dozen collared animals to hunting out of cornfields. And again, and I'm not saying like there's nothing illegal about that. It actually allowing hunters to hunt in cornfields gives relief to our corn farmers because these bears, this food source is such a draw for them that they really can demolish a cornfield, especially those smaller cornfields right on the edge of the woods. But it's just something I think that it's important for us to understand that this is one of those what we call anthropogenic food sources, or a human-related food source, that it's just so appealing for a bear. And it really kind of motivates us to try to do our best to make sure there's enough natural food sources out there so that we can minimize the amount of need for bears to go into areas like this, because it really is a risk for them. All right, so another aspect, which I'm not going to get into in a lot of detail, of the collaring part of the study is that it does give us access to these bears during the denning period. And the nice thing about collaring studies that involve bears is that for a set number of months every winter, these bears are in one spot, and so it gives us an opportunity to go into their dens to replace their collars. And that way we can kind of keep these same animals collared over time, because a study like this, we want to see how these individuals are changing their behaviors in response to the WIN project, and then kind of pool that as a whole. But it's really informative if we have the same animal collared before and after the operation of the project. So going into the dens allows us to keep that animal collared without having to then go out and trap it again, or try to catch it with hounds that next year. So we feel like it's a less invasive way to keep these same animals collared. It also gives us some good indications of the health of our bear population. So this is a habitat study, it's not a population study. So we aren't necessarily prioritizing trying to count females and the number of cubs and survival, but this gives us an indication of the survival and reproduction of our bears, because when we do have a female collared, we get to count how many cubs she had in the den, and if we can keep her collared to that next year, those same cubs should return into that den with her for a second winter, and so we can figure out survival by counting how many of those cubs are still alive that next year. And what we know about bears is the first year of their life is the most difficult, and that's when the majority of them are going to die. If they can make it to their second year, their chances of reaching adulthood have improved significantly.
So the stress placed upon them by disturbing them when the females are denning and
Yeah.
maybe pregnant, is that a concern?
Well, so one thing we do to minimize that is we go into the dens as late in the season as we can. So we're not doing the den visits till March, especially for females, because we want those cubs to be as big and robust as possible. We've learned that our females in this area, because we've always got a lot of snow, they really, it's not until the 1st or 2nd, sometimes even the 3rd week of April, that they're actually getting up and leaving. Like last year was like the 3rd week in April because there was so much snow here. So we try to push them back as late as we can. We also, I go out usually in January and February before we do the den visits, and I do kind of like a reconnaissance visit to kind of scout out where they are and kind of strategically plan how we're going to go. And I do that in a very like a very hunting style way where I'm careful of the winds and careful of noise, so that hopefully they don't even know I'm there. So that when we go back in with our crew, we can also have like a game plan of how we can get to their den in a way that's gonna minimize their knowledge that we're even there and minimize the disturbance. And there's many times that we get in there, we have just a jab stick, which you can see here, which has the needle and syringe on the end of it. And we're kind of just down on our hands and knees sliding it into the entrance and injecting them with the drug, and they never even are aware we're there. So we do the best we can, but of course, doing a collaring study like this, there's some level of invasiveness that goes along with it for sure. So we work hard to try to minimize that as best we can.
Have you had any issues with the collars?
Oh, tons. Bears are rough, you know. They are, they're fighting with each other. They love to like rub on things for scent marking. So they're constantly rubbing on trees, rubbing on telephone poles, rolling on the ground, swimming, crawling in and out of rocks. Collars are malfunctioning. They're also, their necks, especially the adult males, will start getting bigger than their skulls. So you put a collar on, and if they want to, they can just pull it off. So we've actually found that once males get over like 250 pounds, we really can't keep a collar on them. We might still try putting one on, but it's kind of up to the bear at that point if he wants to keep it on. Yeah, so that's a constant struggle. I mentioned earlier, every year we have anywhere from 8 to 14 bears collared in this area. We ideally want 12. But I don't think we've ever maintained 12 or more bears for more than a month at one time because of all the different issues. You know, we also have issues with bears getting hit and killed on the roads. We've lost a number of bears to Route 9 and Route 100. We've had a few bears killed in conflict situations. One was over garbage, one over chickens, and one over corn. We lose bears to hunters every year. So it's a challenge to keep these animals collared. And that is a great segue into this kind of second component that we added to the study using camera traps. So we started getting a little bit concerned as we were getting closer and closer to the Deerfield Wind project breaking ground for construction. And we're putting all this effort into collaring bears, but we're losing bears every year, and all these different things are happening. Because of the breeding season, June is the best time to try to capture bears. It's kind of like when their guard is down. There's not a lot of natural food on the landscape, so it's kind of easier to find them. But we're most interested in knowing what they're doing in the fall. And June to October is a long time, so we tend to like get maybe 12 collared in June, but by October we're down to 5. So we're like, we need another type of data to help get at our objectives as like a backup or a second way to look at this question. So we established these 4 sampling plots, and within each of these plots we have 10 camera traps set up. And what I mean by a camera trap is it's just a camera, like a game camera set up on a tree, and we put those cameras in those same spots every year during the fall and early spring to try to detect just how many bears, not how many, but how many pictures of bears are we getting in those areas. And then we're also able to kind of categorize the types of behaviors the bears are engaging in from those photos. So this photo here is actually a sow with her yearlings, and you can see 2 of them are kind of feeding for nuts on the ground as one of the yearlings climbs up the tree.
Question, what about using a chip instead of a collar?
Yeah, we get that sometimes, and right now the chips are really only good enough to kind of like send out maybe like a frequency so you could hear the animal, but they don't have that GPS component where they're able to collect a location. Yeah, it would be nice if we could just put a little chip under their skin like you would with like your pet or something like that. But the technology is just not quite there yet. So with these cameras, like I said, we're collecting lots of great pictures of bears feeding on beech nuts, and also some cool pictures of bears kind of socializing in these areas near the beach stands. And at this point, I mean, we've collected well over 1,000 pictures of bears at this point, and that doesn't even include this year's data, so it's been a lot.
So no video, just still?
It's just still. Occasionally some of the cameras get bumped onto video by accident, but the types of software that's developed for analyzing this data, pictures are just easier than video. And it also, it allows you to not worry about the memory card getting filled up as quickly too. So one really cool thing we've seen, let me just go back to those maps real quick. So you can see we put 2 plots in the Bear Star Beach stands, and then we put these 2 plots outside of the beach stands to try to serve as a bit of a control. So, and just to also know, what are they doing, you know, how are they using these lands when they're not just feeding on beech nuts? And what we found is that they're doing a lot of kind of more what we would consider social behaviors outside of these beach stands. So these are all pictures collected from those plots, not in the beach stands. And these were all collected in the fall of 2015, so that really good beech nut production year before the Deerfield Wind Project went into operation. And what we think is going on, so you can see in these 3 series here, there's a collared individual, and we knew that that was a subadult male. We don't know for sure who these other 2 bears are, but we can guess that maybe they're also subadult males too, because they look to be about the same size as our collared bear. So what we think is going on is that these bears were probably traveling together that fall because they were subadults. So they're kind of at a really low point on the social pecking order for bears. But maybe being in a group gives them a little more protection from really big adult males. And we're kind of thinking what they're doing is, while maybe a more dominant bear is feeding just below them in the beach stand, they're kind of coming out and resting in these kind of softwood stands just outside of the beach stand, in between their feeding events. And so it's making us think like, man, we're so focused on protecting just these beach stands, but it's almost like there needs to be a little bit of a buffer around the beach stands also, because there's more interactions going on in the surrounding habitat as well. And the other really cool thing about the cameras is that they go off no matter what steps in front of them. So we're getting really great pictures of deer in these areas, and even little fawn nursing, which is pretty cool to see. And of course, we know beech nuts are a good food source for deer as well. We're also getting lots of pictures of moose in these areas, especially on the East Ridge. There seems to be a cow that winters up there every year, and seems to be an area where she stages in the early spring for having her calf and spending some of those quiet early months with her calf, or weeks with her calf. And then we're also getting lots of pictures of some of our fur bearer species, like bobcat, coyote, fisher. We're getting pictures of turkey, grouse, porcupine, snowshoe hare, all these other animals that we may be able to use this data to say, like, okay, we're looking at bears, but really, like I said earlier in the presentation, we look at bears as an umbrella species. We want to know how this might impact all these other species as well, and the cameras might allow us to kind of look at that with kind of a coarse brush. And so, in conclusion, I don't want to give our department the impression that our department, is kind of anti-green energy development. I mean, we understand that that is an important thing to be looking towards, for the health of our environment in the future. But we just want to make sure we're doing this development in a thoughtful way that's going to minimize the most direct negative impacts on our wildlife that exists here on the landscape today. And we just want to make sure that wildlife considerations are put into this balancing act of trying to balance what's right for Vermont in terms of energy development. With that, I'll just say, quick thank you. We've had a lot of cooperators on this study. We've had an amazing team of volunteers and interns. The Forest Service has worked closely with us on a lot of aspects of our field work. USDA Wildlife Services have helped out. West Inc. helped with the initial phase of the study. And then if you're ever in Manchester, Mrs. Murphy's Donuts. They make delicious donuts, and they've been really kind to give us their throwaway donuts to use as bait at our trap sites to capture stuff. And the bears love them. And then I'm just going to put this up while we talk again. These are some of the efforts that our department, or avenues our department has for folks to consider for conservation. We have our Vermont Habitat Stamp and our Non-Game Wildlife Fund, which you can go onto our website to kind of learn more about if you're interested. But I'd be happy to open it up. I know we've already had a lot of great conversations, but if there's other questions, yeah.
Okay, there's supposedly mitigating lands, Meadows End or one of the companies, north of Route 9 somewhere, and it's not as concentrated a beach stand, it's been logged.
Yeah.
What's going on there? Is the federal government buying this land?
It's not the Fed. So what happened, and again, Forrest Hammond, who's the Bear Project leader for the state, so I kind of work under him, and he's in charge, not in charge, but he's involved with the land mitigation aspect of this project. I'm not as directly involved, but through conversations with him, I'm at least somewhat aware of what's going on. So my understanding is that Meadows End parcel was up closer to like Stratton Mountain. So again, not really in this direct area. I don't think the feds were going to purchase it. I'm pretty sure that fell through, but there's been another project. There's a few different projects that they're working on. Maybe I should just say call Frost because he knows the specifics on where those stand. I know he was just in a meeting, I think last week or the week before. But it's been kind of, yeah. My understanding is initially Avangrid, which is the company that kind of operates the Deerfield Wind Energy Project, they were somewhat responsible for trying to do this whole land mitigation part. They were struggling and not able to find a large enough area. They weren't able to find sellers when they did find large enough areas. So in the end, they took that pot of money and shifted it over to our department. And so now we're kind of responsible for finding that land.
The interesting thing is I think this is the first commercial development project in the state of Vermont that has not had to previously mitigate.
And that was a big controversy with this project because Avangrid was really struggling. Yeah, they were struggling to find, like I said, an area that was big enough and that met the standards that were set for them. It needs to be a Bear Scarred Beach concentration. It can't just be, little hodgepodge of beech trees here and there. It really needed to be one of these critical foraging areas for bears. I know there was one site I'm pretty sure they looked into, and then the landowner kind of knew that their feet were to the fire, and so he started jacking up the price, and then that felt like it was starting to get unethical. And
would it need to be in proximity to?
Well,
would you look in the Taconic Range, for instance?
That's one thing that Forrest Hammond and I have talked about, but I don't know is if other folks were involved now and how this is going to happen, or is open to it. It's not a conversation we've really had. We're still really focused here in Vermont. But when we see this data, yeah, I do wonder, gosh, Massachusetts and New York.
There's a lot, all of Coe Lumber's properties has transferred to the Conservation Fund, and they are actively looking to make property transactions, and I'll talk to Frost.
Yeah, okay, please do. And I don't know if you know Jane Lajorchek. She's kind of, reach out to Frost and then he could put you in touch with her. She's kind of in charge of our land conservation program and does a lot of the wheeling and dealing with that stuff. And that's been, you know, it's been an issue is there's so much land already in conservation right here in our study area. So much of it is dominated by the national forest, that, yeah, I think there's been interest in looking in other parts of southern Vermont. I keep advocating that we should stay focused right here. But yeah, it's unfortunately, it's a conversation that is kind of higher up on the totem pole than where I sit at this point. So I don't know the ins and outs of it all. But
Well,
Frost,
it may be, I mean, who knows? You might find 5-10 years down the road, and I hope this study continues for much longer, that the populations or a large segment of them relocates. And that area that they relocate to,
yeah.
the disturbances here, maybe that's what you want to focus your conservation efforts on.
Yeah.
And maybe keep that quiet before the price goes up again.
Yeah, yeah, again, I'm not involved enough to know like how that, how it all works where the landowner was able to figure things out and start kind of holding them ransom with a higher price. But I do know the collaring aspect of the study is very expensive. So I don't know how long we would be able to extend that, but I'm really optimistic that we can at least keep the camera portion of it running for much longer than the collaring part. Because the other thing that could go on is that the bears may be disturbed for a few years, and then we may find that over time they become more comfortable. And I say that because I didn't show an example of this, but we had an adult female collared whose home range really overlapped with the Searsburg project. And we had one year where she denned almost directly under one of those turbines. There was like a big old stump brush pile from like blowdown from the edge of the opening, and she just denned right under there. She's a unique situation because she was also a bear that was visiting Jim Burke's house, who was feeding in Wilmington for years. So she was kind of a unique situation where she had been pretty habituated to people. So she may not be the best representation, but she does make us wonder, like maybe over time, a bear who grows up next to these turbines might be less disturbed than a bear who's an adult when the turbines were built in their home range. I don't know. And so that's where maybe the cameras over time could help us look into that. Yeah.
Can you say that these bears are maintaining the same size and having the same number of cubs as other bears in other areas?
It's tough to say because we aren't, here in Vermont, we aren't handling bears, live bears in any other part of the state. We're only handling bears after they've been harvested. And so, you know, we might be able to look at something like that, but I think it'll be more, we will look at our data from the bears that we've handled. You know, we weigh them when we capture them, we weigh them in their dens, and so we can try to look at something like that. The issue is bears' weights fluctuate like crazy depending on the year and depending on the food availability. They can have major swings. In those beach nut years during the winter, their weights will be way up. But in a year like this where food was really bad, and we had collared bears, sows included, that were down in southern Massachusetts. They were closer to Connecticut than they were to Vermont because that's the only place where there were good acorns. Even northern Massachusetts didn't have great acorns this year. So we had bears traveling to New York, southern Massachusetts. So I expect this year we're going to see all of our bears with really low weights. So it's a good thing, and that's one of those things. If this was a population study, we'd be really focused on, and we're certainly trying to collect the data to see if we can pick up anything with that. But not confident the data we're collecting will really tell us much about that, if that is a factor. Yeah. Is there another? Yeah.
Will you come back in a year?
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you guys invited me here, even though it's a little early, we don't have results, but our hope is, especially once we start really analyzing the data and have firm results, we're definitely going to go on a speaking tour to kind of educate everyone about what we've learned. And this is, the last time we did a bear study in Vermont was in the 90s, and it was associated with ski development on Stratton Mountain. And back then, we were putting on what we call VHF collars. So there was no GPS component. Yeah, exactly. You went out and you had to triangulate each bear. So you were lucky if you got one location a day. And now we're getting, you know, like, in some cases, like dozens upon dozens of locations a day if they're in that fence. So we're learning so much about their habitat use, how they move across the landscape, you know, landscape connectivity issues, how they're interacting with roads, how they're interacting with people's houses. So yeah, we're hoping to share all of this information with you guys.
I'm interested to see what a good mast year with no construction is gonna look like.
Me too.
So
I'm
this
really-
fall,
Yeah.
this fall's data will be
It'll be
interesting to
really
look at.
informative, I think. And whether I have it all, because sometimes I don't get, like, I don't have a lot of this year's data until I go into those dens and get it off the collars.
Oh,
So it might, maybe like, you know, a year and a half from now, I might have that information, but I'll communicate. And if we have it for next winter, I'd certainly be happy to do that. Yeah.
Got a couple of questions. One is, I mean, is the study length long enough for you, do you think, to determine if bears are able to kind of acclimate to the turbines like they acclimate to, you know, moving into people's backyards?
Yeah. I'm not confident that the collaring data will be long enough for that. So I am a little concerned if we do see a major disturbance, that we could say that that's a forever thing. But that's what I was saying before, I hope that we can keep the cameras out for maybe like 10 years down the road. And so if we do see major disturbance, those cameras are pretty inexpensive. You know, I go out maybe a couple times a year to kind of set them up, take them down. So it's a low cost thing that we could kind of do for long-term monitoring to maybe pick up on some of that.
Just a peripheral question. I don't know. Is the bear health and population affected at all by the tick infestation, like the moose?
No, I mean it's a different tick that the one that's affecting our moose herd. It's interesting that you say that because when I first started working on this project in 2014, I would never notice ticks on the bears. And I would say last summer, or I guess the previous summer, was the first time I started noticing ticks on the bears. And I feel like now, it's never a lot, it might just be a couple up near their ears or whatever. But yeah, I'm now just starting to notice they are getting ticks occasionally on them. So I think more southern states where ticks are more prevalent. I've never heard from any of those bear biologists of any major impacts though. So bears are pretty robust.
One good thing anyway.
Yeah, it is, right? One good thing. Yeah.
Is this presentation going to be available in video? Where's the video going to be shown?
I can make it available to Fish and Wildlife when we get it posted, and you can, I don't know, put it on your website.
Yeah, yeah.
It's being videoed in the dark, so
Yeah.
the audio might be better than the video quality, but we'll see.
Yeah.
As far as camera technology, a lot of hunters are getting away from the old-fashioned type of camera that you have to go up to and
Yeah.
check the cards. And the new type of camera is not that much more expensive. I would hope that you people, if you're not using them yet, would use the new type of camera where you can check without going to the camera, because that leaves scent.
Yep.
And also, your flash, in order to get these bears at night, they have a more modern type of flash which they cannot detect.
And our cameras have the modern flash.
Okay.
But they aren't the type. So what I do is I try to go out there at most once a month, and really, in some years, like especially in a good beach nut year, it's like this balance where the bears are really destructive to the cameras also. So especially in those good beach nut years, because again, it's a weird thing that they're not used to encountering. They're very curious. They can smell it, and they will go up to it. They'll rub it, and so sometimes they just reposition it, which can be a problem if it's now pointing at the ground, like we're not collecting data. Other times they will bite it, they tear it off the tree, they drag it away. So I do feel like if we had those cameras, it would be great, because I would know when I need to go back out to replace one. But as it is now, I try to minimize how often I go out there, but I do have to go out there occasionally. Because I'm very conscious of that. Like, I don't want having these cameras out there, and us, if we were out there checking them all the time, that might disturb the bears too. So I try to have a low imprint if we can. But last time I checked, and it's been a couple years, a lot of those cameras required a pretty solid, pretty good cell phone service for them to work. And a lot of these areas, it's pretty marginal.
The best one, this Cuddyback company, they make some of the best. They have a base camera, which is still in the woods.
Okay.
But the others will communicate with it.
Oh.
So the base camera can be far enough away.
Yeah.
And they don't have to use cell phone or any of that business so
Oh.
much.
Yeah, we should look into it. 'Cause as a department, we've been talking more about how can we use these cameras more to help monitor how our wildlife are doing? Because they're such a great non-invasive tool. Yeah, I'll look into that, Justin.
How's the word gotten out about the collared bears not being hunted, or to
Yeah.
avoid shooting them, so that folks know?
I go around and put up signs on as many kind of good hunting access points as I know of. And I've gotten pretty familiar through working with some of the local houndsmen and just following these bears around. So I go around and put up signs, like just informative brief signs, just making people aware. And just, it's not illegal to shoot one of these collared bears, but we ask, please, please don't. Yeah, because it's a lot of time and effort that goes into collaring one of these animals.
And if you do, give us the collar back.
And that's one thing I will say in defense of the folks that have harvested these animals. They've been very cooperative. They always reach out. And these collars, they're black and brown, so they can be a little bit hard to notice. I think they're pretty noticeable, but I've heard from a lot of hunters that they didn't even notice the collar until after they had shot the animal and walked up to it. We also put bright yellow ear tags in their ears to help make them easier to notice. But again, bears are rough. They souse the cubs are tugging on them and occasionally pull them out. The males in particular, because they're fighting with each other, whether it's play fighting like we saw in some of those pictures, or real aggressive fighting from mature males, they're getting torn out. So yeah, between the markings and the signs, and we've done press releases in the area for a few years. It doesn't seem to matter though. If we have more than 10 bears collared, or probably more than 8 bears collared, we can expect to lose anywhere from 1 to 3 bears.
I'm glad that you said the amount, because I think there was something on Fish and Game's Facebook page a while back, and I think some hunters assumed it was 50, 60, hundreds of bears that were collared, and they were complaining that they had gotten their bear tag and they were going to shoot one if they had the tag. And but I'm glad to hear you say it's not that many.
It's not. I mean, it's a pretty small number when you think about it. However, I say that, but there's certainly, I hear from some hunters like, I just keep bumping into this collared bear. It's probably just the location that they're choosing to hunt maybe happens to be in a certain bear's area. But yeah, I mean, if you guys hunt, or if you have friends that are hunters and you hear them griping about that, please spread the word that it's usually anywhere, by hunting season, it's usually only around 10 bears that might be collared, maybe a dozen at most. So.
Now, as far as I hope there's a nuisance bear study going on, so that you could compare whether this project is moving the bears more into being nuisances around garbage and cornfields and whatever than would occur elsewhere in the state at this time in the future.
So we're trying to improve our reporting, what we call our reporting database. So if any of you out there have a conflict with a bear, whether it's getting into your garbage, your bird feeder, whatever, we're starting to try to ask the public to report that to us through our website. Traditionally, what people have done is to report that to their local game warden, who's kind of like our first line of defense, and will come out and give you some information about what you can do. That's really, at this point, the only data we have for conflict stuff that's happening outside of the study area. Within the study area, we have the reported conflicts to our game wardens and to our database, but then I've also just got the callers. So I know when bears are hanging out near people's houses, and I know which people are being the nuisance. I usually don't refer to the bears as being the nuisance. Usually the other way around from my perspective. No, and some people, it's just, you know, they just aren't aware, and once they learn what to do, they make changes. But then we've had some others who potentially create situations that really end badly for the bears, which I'm sure you guys have heard. There's been a lot in the news about people feeding bears in this area. Yeah.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but do you foresee, once your study is done, maybe presenting that to the public utilities folks to give them an idea that if this, you know, situation comes up again in National Forest, that you can say, well, here you go, this is what the results are from it in this National Forest area, so that they can make what would be a more responsible or better decision going forward?
That's the hope. And it's, you know, I hear from people when we talk about the study a lot of frustration that, like, well, what if you find it has a negative impact? They're not going to tear the Deerfield Wind Project down. And it's like, no, unfortunately they wouldn't. But that's the hope, is that we would then have this defensible data to say to the Public Service Board, like, hey, we know that this is going to have a negative impact. There's no arguing about it. But it's a good point. We haven't talked about whether or not we'll be proactive and hold a presentation for them. I think that's a great idea and something that we'll definitely look into, instead of waiting for a project to be presented first.
Well, it would still be important for this area because there's a relicensing. That would be, they always say it's 20 years.
Yeah.
But these sites, once they're impacted, they become free fire zones is the concern, like anything. And they're going to come back with larger or more, or maybe some new technology. Well, it's already been impacted, so if you could, this information may be important to inform that next discussion.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point.
It's not for naught.
Yeah, it is. And it's just, again, you know, our take home on all of this is that bears are a very flexible species, you know, and that was one argument that the folks arguing for Deerfield made, is that these are flexible animals, you know, they're willing to feed in people's backyards. These turbines aren't going to disturb them. And our concern is just this constant chipping away at these important habitats for wildlife. And like, we don't want to get to a point where we've chipped away and then tipped over the edge, and all of a sudden, these, you know, bears need human foods in order to even produce cubs anymore, you know, because they just don't have enough natural food out there.
Or you have an infestation like we're seeing with the emerald ash borer, or something comes in and we lose a huge number of our beach, and every last standing beach is critical.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
Species survival.
Which
so,
you could
like
argue,
the monarch butterfly, you know, we've seen this.
I mean, you could argue it's happening now with the beach bark disease. Like, this, you know, it's, unfortunately, it's probably here to stay, and there's a lot of arguments about how to manage beach stands in the face of this disease, but I certainly think we want to be considerate and thoughtful with what we're doing with beach, because we know it's important for a lot of other animals, not just bears.
The diseased beech is not affecting the bears that are eating the diseased beech nuts?
No, because it's just it's like an insect and a fungus that's really just attacking the bark and the living tissue of the beech tree. So it doesn't have any effect on the bears outside of the fact that it's probably shortening the life of these beech trees that are producing such a good food for these animals.
Got to give them more Mrs. Murphy's donuts.
I know, that's a fear. I know. Yeah.
What you basically were hitting on a little bit a few minutes ago. Okay, suppose they decide that the bears weren't clobbered that bad by these turbines. Now can Killington expand to Little Killington? Way back they were clobbered on that by the Fish and Wildlife Department.
Yeah.
Can condominiums be put on top of ridge lines now? Or where is this going to end? If each one does have an adverse effect.
Yep.
I mean, to say, right now, you can say that has probably got an adverse effect. How much?
Yeah.
And how much cumulative adverse effect? If we allow this, and then we allow 30 more projects because we allowed this,
Yeah.
what is that doing to us?
I know, and that's, that's one thing we're trying to do is kind of step back and take that big picture perspective. It's important to look at these specific sites, but you also need to look at the bigger context of what's happening across this entire region and across the entire state. And, yeah.
You refreshed my mind, you said in the beginning about
Yeah.
who owned that land that they built this on? Us.
We do. Yeah, I mean, it's the National Forest, so the Forest Service manages it, but it's technically all of our land.
That wasn't very good managing.
Yeah, I know, and that's, again, I wasn't here for the initial debate of it all, but that's the frustration I've heard from a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah,
I don't remember them asking me.
yeah, I know, right?
Thank you.
And there is some concern, that they're setting a precedent with this wind project, and by doing this, is this going to become kind of the standard? And that's always been it was kind of a shock for our department because we've always viewed the National Forest as conserved land, and yeah.
You can't ride four-wheelers or wheeled vehicles in it, but yet you put wood turbines in roads so big that you could have a superhighway.
I know.
Yeah.
And the other concern that I have is, so Forrest Hammond and I went down and toured the Florida facility in Massachusetts, which is also owned by the same company, Avangrid, as Deerfield. And they actually, we weren't allowed to go up onto those ridges on those roads without their staff. And they actually called the staff that operated those turbines are based out of Oregon, and they actually had to call them and turn them off for us to safely be able to go up there. I don't think they're going to do the same here with Deerfield, but it's just, yeah, you just wonder what kind of long-term access impacts is that going to have for us. And even still, even if they don't kind of restrict human use up there, they have added a danger factor. During the winter, it's pretty sketchy to go up anywhere near those turbines because they could be flinging ice.
Mm-hmm.
So even then, all of a sudden now, those really robust hunters who maybe did want to hike up and hunt in those beach stands, I'd think twice about it on a kind of wet November cold morning where there could be ice building up on those turbines.
I just think it goes back to us dealing with the federal government, telling them they're lousy stewards of our land.
Well, I certainly, you're entitled to express that opinion to them. And more power to you to do it. Yeah. Yeah, in the back, okay, yeah.
Well, there was litigation to try to prevent this whole project.
There was.
There was, Vermonters for a Clean Environment, and I was one of the litigants.
Okay. You probably know more about it than we did.
But we lost, and there was no money for an appeal.
Yeah.
It seemed to be a very prejudiced judge. Judge J. Garvin Murtha allowed us to go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and that's honestly why we have so many years of baseline preliminary data. We were only supposed to get maybe 2 years of pre-construction data, but that litigation, it held things up for a
You were
while.
on our side, yeah.
Yeah. But, yeah.
It's what happens when you mix science with politics.
It's tough.
Senator Sanders was involved, our whole delegation was rah-rahing this. So, there was a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And it's tough. I think again, I think it's right to try to think about ways to get off of our dependency on oil, but yeah, it's tough to know what the right move is. There are a lot of things about this project that I think, rubbed a lot of people wrong. I think especially because it was happening on our public lands.
Well, we can't use it the way you want. You can't, like you said, four-wheelers, you can't do
Yeah.
this kind of stuff, but yet they'll allow a project like that to go in there.
Yeah, it was controversial for sure.
One of my questions is I have heard that there has been some discussions that the National Forest lands are actually being considered to be turned over to the states to be managed. Is that true? What I've heard being true? And has there been any discussion from the state and the state level to consider a master plan to manage what is now Green Mountain National Forest lands within the state?
So the first part of your question is that, I'm not sure where things stand with all of that, but that is something that's going on. But my understanding is mainly in the western part of the U.S. with Bureau of Land Management lands, or what people call BLM lands, not the national forest. So there's a whole suite of different types of public federal lands. And yeah, but that is a big push happening in some western states. I think it's only with Bureau of Land Management lands though. And it's another reason, if you care about public lands, to contact your representative and have that conversation with them about how they feel about those big national questions about it. Here in Vermont, as far as I know, there's been no conversations about it, again, because I don't think the national forest is part of that conversation at this point at least. But yeah, if that started to happen, we would definitely be having meetings to figure out how we could best handle that. Because again, we look at the state lands, it's like, again, these are lands for you, the citizens of Vermont. We want everyone to be able to kind of have access and have opportunities to enjoy natural resources. But we're not looking to take away federal lands necessarily at this time.
I wish you would.
Well, I know, maybe it would, in some states it might be a good thing.
I wish you would.
Yeah, sorry, at least at this time that's not happening here. But good question. Any other thoughts or concerns? Just general, yeah.
Thank you for doing the wildlife due diligence, because people always monkey with one tiny little component without the vision or knowledge or the ability to anticipate the ripple effect that it'll have years and generations and eons in the future. So by just taking the attitude of, let's look at this before we monkey with it,
Yeah.
you're doing us all a favor. Thank you for being passionate about your work.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate all of your interest in this as well. And like I said, have faith that we have these specific objectives for this study that are top priority, and we're going to do our best to get at the root of what's going on. But we do have plans to take all this data and try to apply it to a lot of other conservation questions we have related to bears. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, we feel like we're going to have some really good information about landscape connectivity and habitat connectivity and how bears are moving across the bigger landscape. And if, again, like I said earlier, if we can do right by bears, we're hoping that we're also going to be doing right by a lot of other species as well. So, yeah, stay tuned. I promise I can come back and give updates as we have them.
Will you put these studies online too? I read the interim studies, but will these also be?
Yeah, so whenever a final report will definitely be online. And gosh, I started working with our outreach folks to just put some better information about the study instead, because those interim reports are useful, but they're a little technical at times. So this will be a good motivation for me to kind of start coordinating with them again, to just have some of these maps and just some of this big picture stuff about the study on our website, so that it's a little more accessible to everyone. We've just been so busy chasing these bears around that sometimes this side of it gets kind of put on the back burner for a while. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
To say nothing of chasing a 1-year-old.
Oh, yeah, then you go 1-year-old.
I want $40,000 in the